So if you imagine you're a customer or you're a building operator and you have all those buildings in your portfolio, and you know that by 2040, 2050, depending on what your organizational goal is, that you must decarbonize them. It's obviously a significant undertaking, one which requires a lot of capital and also a lot of energy and a lot of resources internally. So the key is making these decisions at scale and highly accurately. So that really is something that we'd stress out a lot.
Yes, you got it right. This is a new series, Building Green, Decarbonizing Construction, and you can listen to the entire conversation right after this. Hello and welcome back to the Mission Shunya podcast. Yes, I am returning with yet another series of conversation, and this theme is called Building Green, Decarbonizing the Construction Sector. Did you know that the construction industry, the built environment, is responsible for nearly 30 to 40% of global carbon emissions? The way we design, build, and operate our structures has a profound impact on the environment. In our previous series, we explored the pillars of ESG, environmental, social, and governance frameworks, and their role in reshaping industries. In this series, we are diving deeper into one of the most significant sectors for environmental transformation, construction. The construction sector is at a crossroads. With a growing urgency to meet global climate goals, decarbonizing how we build is no longer optional, it's essential. But how do we tackle such a massive challenge while balancing cost, innovation, and sustainability? That's the journey we are embarking on in this series. Hope we'll cover some solid ground in this series. ESG principles call for accountability and transformation across industries. Decarbonizing construction represents a powerful intersection of environmental stewardship, innovation, and social impact. So, to look at how this transformation looks in practice, we have one global practitioner. So, who's our first guest in the series and what is his focus?
Hi, I'm Jack. I'm a chartered building services engineer and a practitioner working in building decarbonisation and focused specifically on the decarbonisation of non-domestic real estate assets.
This current theme around the decarbonization of the construction sector and the past theme around ESG, I think you fit the bill, say if I were to put it this way, this transition episode in a way between ESG and the decarbonization of the construction sector. So before we actually get into the conversation in detail, you did a master's in Cambridge and you've been an entrepreneur. So how did this journey kind of from your education to right where you are with Terra Instinct, how did that come about? Have you always been passionate about this sector?
Yeah, so I guess I've been interested and involved in the construction sector since really the age of 14 or 15. So I actually did an apprenticeship as a plumber, so as a commercial plumber. So my role back then was to install heating and cooling and ventilation systems in non-domestic buildings such as schools, hospitals, more complex systems. So I really was, and that's known as being a contractor in the construction sector. So I really escalated through that quite quickly and did a 4-year apprenticeship and then undertook a night school HND, which was a engineering design course, which was the next logical step to try and further my career. And then, so that was all done up in the Northwest. I then was fortunate enough to get reasonable grades on that college course and went down to London South Bank University, where I did an undergrad degree in building services engineering. So building services engineering, for those who aren't aware, is quite a niche engineering sector, although it's all around us in every element and facet of the built environment. So CIBSE, who are the Chartered Institute of Building Services Engineers, define the profession as really, we breathe life into buildings. So without us, you would have no lighting, you'd have no heating or power or cooling or ventilation. You'd have no alarm systems, vertical transport, lifts, etc. So we really, breathe life into the built environment. But of course, with that life comes energy and the consumption of energy and also the emission of carbon emissions and a vast amount as well. So from there, I then moved to Australia and undertook a role with AECOM, who are a global consulting firm. They're massive. They're one of the biggest players. And I was then a mechanical engineer in the Melbourne Building Services team. And I was really, really fortunate with some of the projects that I was afforded the opportunities to work on, from commercial towers, so 50-story towers, to airport projects, to large healthcare projects and large education projects as well. So my role was to be responsible for the delivery of documentation and then moving through to the management of engineers and their development of documentation right the way through to construction admin and running and managing construction projects with major developers. So during that time, I undertook a project in the Middle East. It was a large commercial tower, which was due to be twice the height of the Burj Khalifa. So the Burj Khalifa currently stands at around 830 meters tall. I believe there's a building in Jeddah that's due to exceed that, but at the time it was the largest building. And my role on the project was to undertake the concept design as a building physicist for a 1,600 meter tall tower in a location that will remain nameless for the purposes of this podcast. But really, I was focused on trying to change the orientation of the buildings to reduce the cooling loads and the solar glare, etc. And then I had an epiphany, really, which was, you're talking thousands and thousands of tons a year of carbon emissions that would be emitted from the asset, and also the embodied carbon emission considerations of all the concrete and steel that would be needed. So I then had an epiphany and thought, well, what am I contributing towards? And it really got me interested in sustainable development. So then I moved back to the UK, undertook a master's degree in engineering for sustainable development, which is a great course run by an amazing academic team. And I shared that experience with lots and lots of very interesting colleagues. I believe you did the same masters as well, so you can attest to that.
Yes.
And it was a great year. And unfortunately, COVID cut it slightly short, but still, I was very fortunate to have undertook it. So yeah, thanks for bearing with me, everyone. But that's kind of a long-winded description of how I got here. And I also set up a number of consultancies, as well as a machine learning-backed startup, which essentially decarbonizes non-domestic buildings.
Wow, that's a wonderful journey. I have to emphasize the word journey because starts from the top, goes down under, and then to the Middle East, and then back to the UK. So that's a wonderful experience that you bring to this conversation. And right from getting your hands dirty to then doing the top level design consultancy projects, I think you covered it all so far. Definitely believe that you will have a lot more experiences to share. But as you transitioned in this period and as you moved on to setting up more consultancy practices and got into engagements, I believe there's one key thing that caught your attention. Like, one was decarbonization. The other was how are commercial spaces, like for example, businesses, thinking about ESG in particular. And how did you come into this space between if I were to say, the intersection of decarbonization of the construction sector and ESG?
Yeah, interesting question, and thank you for your compliments about my journey. Yeah, it's been quite an interesting thing so far, and hopefully will continue into the future. But in terms of decarbonisation, I guess I first became interested just because of my understanding of the problem. So the problem in the UK alone is vast, right? So we, on a macro level, we understand that the built environment contributes 38 to 40% of global carbon emissions. Roughly 20% are from the operation of buildings, so the active energy consumption within a building, and that be from the systems I mentioned before, heating, cooling, ventilation, etc. And the rest is from the embodied carbon and supply chain emissions, etc. So in the UK alone, there are 2.1 million non-domestic buildings, and we estimate that between 80 and 90% of those must decarbonise. Some already are all electric, so they utilise non-fossil fuel thermal energy systems, so they've only got scope 2 emissions to worry about. But the number of buildings really that need to decarbonise is vast. And then if you branch that out further into Europe and America and include those, that's in the order of 20 million non-domestic buildings that all need to decarbonise. So it is a massive, massive problem and a huge sub-element of really the transition towards a zero carbon future. and one which really, for me, has not been tackled properly or appropriately yet, both from a policy perspective and also the emerging methods to undertake these studies and subsequent implementation. The reason I then became interested in the broader ESG element, so from a corporate perspective, is I have had many conversations with a range of corporate bodies, whether it be real estate investors, asset managers, even healthcare providers, or any type of corporate really that has some form of real estate asset under management. It's interesting to me to try and understand what the drivers might be, or the levers you can pull to try and attempt to leverage the client to undertake building decarbonisation. And when you understand specifically how that organisation is run and what the drivers might be, that makes it more likely that you'll actually be able to pull the right lever and push them onto the journey towards a zero carbon future. So the link between policy and technical methods and really understanding the pain points of the client, I think that's really key to trying to get some of these projects over the line.
That's true. You mentioned about the big problem. It's a global problem and everyone kind of acknowledges that. But when it comes to the integration with the ESG, I think it's between the policy and the regulatory framework that the entire thing has to fit. So I'm sure there are some regulatory frameworks and that kind of gets all those things in together when we talk about decarbonization for a corporate or a business customer. So where do you fit in as a consultant into the entire value chain? At what stage do you get involved? And what all services do you offer? Do you go the entire end-to-end, or do you just do the planning and then the monitoring part?
Yeah, it's interesting. So the first point to make is the broad policy landscape includes things such as SBTI, which is Science Based Targets Initiative. They've recently brought out a building decarbonisation standard or guide, which essentially is ratifying the requirements for corporates who've signed up to SBTI to then conform to that guide and give a very clear pathway and understanding of the need for building decarbonisation. In the UK, which tends to be a pioneer with policy around and design guides around building decarbonisation, the Net Zero Carbon Building Standard has recently been launched in pilot phase, and that's been a consortium group of upwards of 400 or 500 industry professionals that have actually developed out that guide. And that's a really exciting couple of developments in the landscape. So the broad intent with building decarbonisation essentially is to mitigate scope 1 or direct emissions. So to essentially phase out fossil fuel thermal energy systems and switch to electric or essentially non-fossil fuel type. The second then is to try and attempt to mitigate energy consumption across the site, which would be looking at opportunities to reduce energy demand through insulation, enhanced lighting, glazing, etc. So you trim the energy and carbon footprint of the asset as much as possible, and then subsequently look at electrification and then the integration of renewables. So that's really the overarching process. That looks specifically at the operational carbon emission side, and of course there's the embodied carbon or whole life carbon to look at too. So in terms of where we get involved, and really this is something that's been developed out over several years now. So we're trying to offer value across the full project lifecycle. So if you align it to the REBA plan of work, which is generally a framework for construction projects, so you start right from a point of, well, you and I could sit down and, okay, we want to decarbonise a building, right? So that's stage 0. And then we work through the design phases. So we undertake what's called a net zero carbon study, which sets out what you'd understand as a high level strategy. And then you'd move from there, and then you'd move into the technical or engineering design phase, which is where you essentially add the technical rigor into the initial findings from the studies. And then you're engaging the likes of cost consultants, architects, etc., to help you with the integration of that design and the development of it. And then the final piece of the puzzle really is the implementation, which is where you would then manage or oversee the contracting works. So whether it be switching out gas boilers for heat pumps when they come to the end of their life cycle, or whether it be looking at phasing retrofit insulation across walls, floors, roofs, etc. Obviously, there's a significant cost and disruption and time frame increment that you need to look at to actually embed these projects into an existing asset. So really offering value across the full life cycle of the projects is key, because many of the clients that you work with, you could undertake a really detailed net zero carbon study and they wouldn't know what the next step would be. That's something we find quite a lot.
That's true. In terms of implementation as well. I think we all kind of agree that it's easy to do something when you do it right from the start. But when it comes to looking at decarbonization of the existing infrastructure, real estate, I think that is when the intervention is kind of lot of challenges. So most key aspect of it, of course, one is the wider objective that getting to net zero. But I'm sure the conversation when you pitch to clients and when the clients come to you, the conversation also boils down to the
Correct.
cost benefit analysis and what are the financial gains that we have. So how do you address that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned before the startup that we developed where with my co-founder, a chap named Robert Rouse, Dr. Robert Rouse, who's based at the Department of Mathematics at Cambridge. So we have developed out essentially a multi-component machine learning framework method to undertake the optimized generation of decarbonisation studies for non-domestic buildings. And one of the key outputs from those studies is, of course, the CapEx, OpEx, and return on investment of those intervention strategies. So there seems to be an issue in the industry at the moment where a lot of the incumbents or the larger companies that would go out and undertake these decarbonisation studies, the methods that they utilise are unempirical. They are extremely time consuming. They could take anywhere from 8 to 12 weeks, and they're very expensive as well. And the methods that are used are based on just quite simple Excel modelling, which can be very laborious and essentially don't look at the asset as an ecosystem. So elements of the building will be taken in isolation, and there's a failure to understand how the climate, how the occupants, and how the building existing system configurations actually all work together to make and form this ecosystem of an asset. So the key really that we're finding is the understanding how the asset operates, how it really talks to the environment around it, and then understanding how to specify key and effective intervention strategies, and then setting them across a timeline, giving budget cost estimates, which then can enable customers and asset managers and building owners to make informed decision on the strategy and general master plan of how to decarbonise their portfolios. Because it's also worth remembering that some of the organisations that we speak to, have building portfolios in excess of 8 to 10,000 globally, or perhaps just nationally, maybe 1 to 2,000. So if you imagine you're a customer or you're a building operator and you have all those buildings in your portfolio, and you know that by 2040, 2050, depending on what your organisational goal is, that you must decarbonise them, it's obviously a significant undertaking, one which requires a lot of capital and also a lot of energy and a lot of resources internally. So the key is making these decisions at scale and highly accurately. So that really is something that we'd stress out a lot.
It's interesting that you mentioned towards the end that scale and accuracy is also key, especially as we talk about scope 1, 2, 3 and getting to the scope 3 emissions and getting all those data captured. I think that's a bigger challenge. But you didn't mention that technology plays a key enabler in terms of your client base or using this technology that you have adopted. What is the client base that you can serve? Do you have to eventually look at large players having multiple big assets, or can you also look at like a small and medium enterprise clients who are also keen to get to the net zero targets in their own way? Is the technology kind of adaptive in that sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So the various enterprises that I'm involved with are really agnostic to the company size, or clients, or the organizational size of the clients that we work with. And the reason for that is obviously an asset is an asset, right? And they all need to decarbonize. The key consideration around complexity is interesting. So when you look at when you think about real estate, you hear the term asset classification frequently. And what that means is the composition of a customer's building portfolio. So depending if it's a real estate investor, for example, they may have particular areas of focus for their funds. So they'll refer to that as a thesis. So you might see customers that have data centers and light industrial or logistics, or they may have large institutional buildings that they manage, or they may have a real mix. And obviously the complexity, that is a challenge for different platforms to be able to cope with, and how technology can be nimble and agile enough to understand the different considerations. But then also, if you pull that back and just think about it empirically and apply mathematics and science to the problem, ultimately an asset, a building is a building, right? And there are obviously different levers and parameters and metrics that you can understand, but it's about really what's key is understanding the existing conditions. And then that way, once you appropriately understand the existing conditions, you can then formulate really targeted intervention strategies. So just on the technology front as well, so the landscape is such that there seems to be quite a saturated market in terms of the competitors for building optimization. So building optimization is essentially looking at that energy reduction element that I mentioned before. So whether that be understanding ways to tune control systems or building management systems, or perhaps primary ventilation air handling units and AHU schedules. So there's a lot of companies out there that do that. And that might give you, say, 5 to 15 to 20% reduction in energy consumption across a year, which is great. But unfortunately, doesn't get you to net zero. All that does is trim the emissions, which is a vital part, but not the whole element. So the area at which the gap really is in that more macro ecosystem approach to decarbonisation. So that's something that we don't see very, very frequently in the market, and something that we're targeting at the moment.
That's interesting. Again, going back to this, it kind of reminds me the question that we started with, because the policy and regulatory environment is also kind of changing. Now, when we look at all these parameters, what are they benchmarked against? Like, are there any challenges in kind of non-availability of uniform code or practice? You did mention about SBTI earlier in the conversation. Is that the standard? But is that the standard that can be adopted globally, or do you face challenges because in some regions, some countries, this is not clearly defined? So is there a gray area in that sense?
That's an interesting question, actually. So, of course, like any engineering sector, there's a variability in how policy and design guides are developed for different regionalities, and also the different and varying drivers for those jurisdictions to promote building decarbonisation. So, I mean, my experience of that and what I've seen previously, having worked in different regionalities, you'll tend to leverage Western European, American, and perhaps now Chinese engineering design guides and policy, and then they seem to set the key benchmark. But then, so there's the engineering perspective, and technically, how do you do it? And then the secondary one is the policy, and so one's informing us how to do it, and the other is actually driving the requirement. So I think as well with the SBTI example, obviously the corporates that have signed up and set in stone their benchmarks and baseline carbon metrics, they've obviously got a requirement then to carry on and begin to decarbonise their asset stock. So for me, that's relatively jurisdictionally agnostic, i.e. I imagine they may view certain jurisdictions as a high priority, but ultimately we'll have to do them all. So that is quite an interesting area. But what we're noticing is the Western Europe, United Kingdom, and also China and other parts of Eastern Asia seem to be the most developed. The USA, in terms of traction with building decarbonisation, for me, anecdotally, feels less developed at the moment.
That's interesting. Now, it perfectly leads me to the next question around we did cover jurisdictions, countries, regions. So as a business and as a practitioner in the space, so how do you plan to scale the business and your practice globally?
Yeah,
because you do have the technology background and the platform ready. I think this space is kind of going to be in a position where you have the right platform, right technology, and then I think it should be scalable easily. What do you think?
Yeah, indeed. So the strategy there generally would be to essentially begin with getting a real foothold in the UK and Western European markets. And the reason for that is, I spoke of the numbers earlier. It's a hugely significant market.
Correct.
So 2.1 million alone in the UK. And then really, like any business, it's the key thing there is to form partnerships with organisations that have real estate assets across multiple jurisdictions. Because the beauty of the technology methods that we're building out is they are agnostic to climate or regionality, etc. It's just one of the many metrics that we capture. So the platform itself can pivot to different regionalities for sure. That's something that we're very keen on building out. And I think the policy, the variance in policy is also an interesting thing when you're trying to scale tech.
Correct.
So understanding what the constraints are with policy, and also something else which we're in discussion a lot at the moment is the limitations of the local market, whether it be labour or whether it be the availability of certain hardware that you can actually embed within buildings. So perhaps the lead times of different types of heat pumps in different countries may be significantly different. That all should be factored in. So as a systems thinking approach, the complexity associated with a lot of these strategies is significant.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really trying to provide as much transparency as possible for clients that are making these decisions. When do we retrofit our gas boilers? When do we look at instigating a holistic glazing uplift? So there's all these questions that need to be answered, and at the moment, and the current tools that are currently available in the market just don't cut it.
That's good. That's good in a way that the thing is scalable, but also definitely see there's a lot of challenges also in terms of integration. So that's interesting. So Jack, on a final note, let's go back to the big picture from where we actually started. Now, when you look at how the sector is playing out globally from your perspective of having seen the space evolve over the last few decades now, how do you think this will play out globally in terms of the impact that it could have? And do you think this will kind of aid the net zero transition, say, by 2050 globally, or what is your view on this?
Yeah, absolutely. So that is a really interesting question from the perspective of, we don't have a crystal ball, but all I do know is the things that need to be in place for us to have any hope whatsoever of decarbonising the building stock, certainly in the UK and beyond. So the provision of decarbonisation studies must happen rapidly, accurate studies that are cost effective, and also shed ultimate transparency on the intervention strategies possible. I think there's a huge void in the labour force across most developed economies that I'm aware of at the moment, with actual skills and education around green technologies integrating into existing buildings. So that's something that the UK specifically is grappling with at the moment. I mean, having worked in the building decarbonisation space specifically for 5 to 6 years, I've certainly noticed a shift in how receptive customers and clients are to even talk about it. And also I noticed a flow of capital that is shifting and becoming available for not only the studies themselves, but also the implementation works. So I believe that this will keep building engineers, technicians, practitioners, construction managers in employment for, certainly the rest of my lifetime. Just given the sheer numbers and scale of the market and the frankly mind-blowing amount of construction work that needs to happen. It really is difficult to overstate the size and scale of the challenge that we have in front of us. I mean, I'm to temper it with a degree of optimism. As I say, I am certainly seeing a lot of shift in the market, and I'm excited at what the future holds for the construction sector, because it's a really, really critical element of the movement to a net zero future.
Perfect. That's actually true. I mean, we have to have a lot of optimism in this space and just believe that we are all working towards moving the dial in the right direction. So thanks, Jack. Thanks for joining the podcast and having this conversation with me today.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for your time and everybody for listening.
Well, that's a wrap on the first episode on this series. I hope it gave you an overview on policy, technology, and the key customer pain points in decarbonizing the construction sector. Of course, with the right technology, we can get the platform to scale across the world. Join us as we lay the foundation for a greener future, one episode and one conversation at a time. Don't forget to subscribe, share your thoughts, and let us know the topics you'd like us to dive into. missionchunya@gmail.com is the ID, and of course, we are available on all social media platforms. Links to connect with Jack are in the show notes section of this episode. So until next time, this is Girish Shivakumar signing off, and as always, thank you for listening.